Hello again. Now, South Africa is facing a critical challenge of high youth unemployment, with over 60% of 15 to 24-year-olds struggling to find meaningful employment. And as the country is ushering in the 7th administration, the question for many is how can the government of national unity effectively address this crisis? To discuss this further, I'm joined in studio by Economist Sfiso Skenjana. Sfiso, welcome to eNCA. Thank you very much for joining us, especially taking time on this afternoon of a national public holiday. But it is about youth, and the country's biggest crisis is youth unemployment. I just interviewed about 2 hours ago an analyst in KwaZulu-Natal about what the provincial government should really prioritize. And Dr. Imran Bakar says, no, it should prioritize employment for the young people in the province. Because we know it's not just a provincial issue, it's a national issue. All the political parties that are in the government of national unity, led by the ANC that secured 40% of the national vote, in their manifesto spoke about creating jobs, addressing the issue, all of them differently. Different numbers were used. For example, the ANC promised 3.5 million work opportunities, not jobs. 3.5 million work opportunities. Others promised different numbers and stuff. Now they're going to be sworn in. We don't know who's going to be who in the cabinet. But what do you think the new incoming 7th administration should do differently from what has been done and promised over the last 30 years to really make a dent on youth unemployment?
Sure. Good evening, Ntate Dan Moyane. I mean, I think leading up, of course, to now where we are, there is some literature I did publish where I was actually analyzing some of the manifestos coming from the parties, and my findings were that every manifesto was a sandwich short of a picnic in terms of truly understanding and really resolving the jobs conundrum in South Africa. And, leading up to this conversation, I actually went into a little bit of analysis as well in terms of where we found ourselves in a space where there are coalitions, and I looked at England, I looked at Australia. What has happened post-coalition in terms of specifically youth outcomes, and the number of things that emerged, particularly in those two studies. In England, we found that a lot of the developmental variables that are facing or looking at young people, including school completion, alcohol consumption, drugs, early childhood, pregnancies, etc., all of those variables started regressing when there was coalition governments in place. We also looked at research that came through there looking at what we often speak about as ALMPs, or active labour programs, and funding towards, and that came out of Australia, towards ALMPs actually started regressing when there was coalition government. In addition to that, we looked at what happened in terms of, positioning around employment outcomes. And in a coalition environment, we found that labour context was more liberalised and ultimately led to weaker, labour protection as well as labour support. If we are to then go back and look at what happened in South Africa from 1994, as we moved from the RDP to GEAR, almost something quite similar happened, is that GEAR was kind of pro-market, it said liberalised labour, and also the South African Forum, which was a collection of companies, also came out with similar literature saying that tighten up on or loosen up on the labour context. Yet in a South African context, we know that, for example, organised labour has been so useful in reducing inequality in so many ways, as well as, of course, job placement and fair job opportunities. And so I think the coalition space is really going to be complex for us on an
Does your research,
outlook.
from what you've said, show that pro-market type policies or pro-market type government of national unities will create more challenges for youth employment, or will increase youth unemployment?
Absolutely. The literature absolutely suggests that a pro-market position is certainly negative for labour. I looked at President Ramaphosa's last term, which was the 6th administration, and even if you look at the labour profile in terms of full-time employment and part-time employment, there's actually been a shift to more labour going, being transferred into part-time employment. That actually creates a lot of course, uncertainty, labour vulnerability, etc. And already that was the kind of, the Ramaphoria that we were breathing into the economy, which is market first, market first. And the World Bank, in fact, 2015, went back on their position and said in South Africa, having then spent the time understanding our market, that we really have to think about a really good blend between, pro-social development kind of overlays into then a pro-market position.
So the likes of COSATU, who's an ally of the ANC, that's got 40% now, coming out and say, we're going to be watching this GNU. We're not really in favor of working with the DA because they're not pro-workers. They may have a case.
No, absolutely. And I think they just find themselves in a very tough space in terms of organized labor. They found themselves deeply stratified, and so they don't have the voice that they used to have. I don't think they've done enough work to research as well and say, how do you respond as organized labor to a gig economy, to a complex youth context as well? And so I think also it's partly they're doing that they really find themselves in a tough position, but I think the argument is very sound.
So pro-social development, government of national unity does not really exist from the research that you've done. But South Africa is a different kettle of fish. It's got certain historical contexts and complexes. You would need that lens to be used. You'd need the 7th administration to do differently from the 6th administration. What is that difference?
So, I mean, there's a number of things that are going to be interesting, and we were talking offline that, of course, outgoing Minister Thulasnus is not there in the Department of Employment, but it's even in, for example, how do you enforce compliance? We've got, I think the number is about 87% of the companies that have been surveyed are non-compliant with minimum wage in South Africa. And so when we think about that and says, then maybe let's start to think about creating a new labor force of labor inspectors, and that is kind of semi-skilled and unskilled labor that you can quickly absorb. They do all of the work that labor inspectors would be doing, but they're walking the streets and they really, I think, improving what we want in terms of equitable employment outcomes.
Will it matter who's the Minister of Labour? I don't know. We don't know what portfolios are going to come out. When the Ramaphoria began, the Tumamina phase began, we were told by Matamela Ramaphosa himself, he's going to look into the structure of the government, the size of the cabinet. There was criticism that there's too many ministers and too many deputies and fix it. But now the voices of opposition like the DA that were clamoring for a streamlined government are now part of government, So we don't know how many ministers we're going to end up with. Are we going to have a bloated structure? Are we going to have a streamlined structure? And who's going to play a critical role? Should we be watching and observing carefully who will be the minister of, let's call it labor, or, currently it's labor and employment?
Sure, I think we must. I think we want to hear the posture, because that will tell us whether or not they understand the structural constraints that inform why we've got an unemployment issue and a crisis the way it is. And so we often talk about structural transformation as the contribution between primary sector, secondary as tertiary, and saying, as then the incoming Labour Minister, do you understand how to reorganize your investment to ensure that that is reflected in terms of the profile of our labour force?
Yeah, some people are worried because you've got in the GNU the likes of the DA. The DA, in its manifestos, said minimum wage, no, we're not for minimum wage. Number two, we are not for black economic empowerment. Well, with all its successes and failures that everybody knows about. No, we are also not for employment equity, for example. Now, they have pro-market friendly labour outlook or philosophy as a DA. They're going to be sitting around this cabinet now, and they are together with the ANC that's supposed to be driving transformation in terms of the changes. It's going to be a very tricky balance to strike to make a dent on the single biggest crisis this country faces in youth unemployment. I mean, between 60% of young people between the age of 16 and 24 today can't find any meaningful employment.
I mean, I think it's a fallacy that the DA's position on labour is pro-market. Professor Card, who was a Nobel laureate, part of his experiments were around will an increase in minimum wage result in negative employment outcomes. And he did a number of experiments and found that does not hold true. And he's a Nobel laureate on the back end of that. In fact, he found that total factor productivity went up by between 2.5% and 8%, depending on the sector you are looking at. And so that's not pro-market, because if if an improved wage context actually results in higher productivity, that's pro-market.
So a national minimum wage will benefit productivity, therefore
absolutely.
the economy starts being more productive and things get moving.
100%, and this is why we must then debunk this pro-market position that the DA is taking around labour outcomes in South Africa. It hasn't been proved. The professors who talk about these zombie ideas is that we disprove things and then they keep re-emerging as zombies when they've actually got no literary basis.
Now, it's a big challenge to fix unemployment in this country in an environment where the economy is set to grow about 0.6% this year, according to the World Bank, although Lesisha Kganyago, governor of the Reserve Bank, puts it at a different 1-point-something%, but it's still very low. I mean, what would you, as a young South African, like to see this seventh administration really prioritizing if they want to move the needle and get youth unemployment down and get productivity high? You've just mentioned that national minimum wage is a good thing, but what else do you think they should focus on?
I mean, we've seen 13 years of jobless growth, and so South Africa, there isn't a meaningful trickle-down effect that when the economy grows, employment grows. And so what does the kind of seventh administration focus on? They focus on vocational skills, and so I think we've got to up the profile of our TVET colleges. They make that Department of Small Business Development a bigger department. I mean, they've got one of the smallest budgets in the country, yet when you look at in the informal economy, young people in mechanics space, young people as barbers and salon owners in the care space as well. That's the space where people are finding meaningful entrepreneurial opportunities as well. And so for me, if we double click on that, as well as double clicking on the administration component of compliance within the wage space and the labor space, I think we might start to see meaningful developments coming through. And lastly, of course, an investment in innovation.
And what about a sector like agriculture? I'm asking this against the background of information. I don't know all the details. Like Brazil, a few years ago, went into the rule of denting unemployment, including that of their youth. And Brazil is a middle-income country like us in South Africa, and is part of us in the BRICS bloc. You know, they've got huge challenges with poverty as well. They reduced unemployment by 5 million by supporting smallholder farmers in agriculture differently. For example, saying if you're a smallholder farmer, we will give you the implements that you need, we will give you the fertilizer, we will even buy the product from you at a set price and supply the prisons, supply the police, supply public hospitals. So you have a market already. You don't have to worry. You just produce and stuff. And they managed to dent that. But in our country, we've got also fertile arable land.
I mean, our agri sector has been one of the few sectors that, I mean, I think they had dropped employment all the way to about 600,000. They're back to 900,000 now. So they've been growing over the last few years in the kind of the employment context specifically, and also just looking in terms of our level of competitiveness in the space. And we often talk about, our revealed comparative advantage. Our deciduous fruit is really competitive globally in the context of that space. It's definitely a space we ought to invest in. In fact, we've regressed. We used to have extension officers. We used to have people in the villages supporting people with dipping their livestock, etc. Those people are not there. That's an opportunity to bring back that labor force as well, bring back the community-based opportunities as well in terms of design from an agglomeration point of view. Agriculture, we're seeing those things work. There's an example in Butterworth with Ivili Loboya in terms of how they've created a cooperative of women in terms
Ivili Loboya.
Ivili Loboya. It's a cooperative wool cleaning, wool sorting, etc. They go to the villages and collect shared wool. That goes into a manufacturing plant, and you've seen them now on SA Fashion Week, London, Milan, etc. And so there's real value stream participation on the back of just deepening your support in the primary space, which was just wool and wool collection, sorting and cleaning. So these are all the opportunities that are available in the agri space.
Is there opportunity in industrialization? Because Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC, they speak a lot about industrialization. We must have more black industrialists, but there's agriculture, there's other sectors. I mean, is there something, when you hear the word industrialization, do you think it can help us dent youth unemployment?
Absolutely. I mean, we deindustrialized in 2001 in South Africa in terms of the flow of investments, and the challenge is that in the way in which it expresses itself is that we've got then a small primary sector, and then now we've got a kind of a burgeoning tertiary sector. And so there's a reinvestment that's got to go into the primary sector, because where you're sourcing your inputs, if you don't have your inputs to then drive the industrial process, and then you become, of course, a price taker in terms of then you're importing, that your import intensity goes up, and then, of course, you become uncompetitive. And so the primary sector, I think, is going to be the primary thrust to then us having an opportunity to meaningfully industrialize as a tertiary, as a secondary sector.
Yeah, you, like me and many other people in South Africa, and especially us in the media, we are building up to the inauguration of Matamela Ramaphosa for his second term as president in a new government of national unity, okay? We don't know who's going to be in the cabinet. We're all waiting to see who's going to occupy what seat. There's all kinds of speculation, like the DA is not interested in the deputy president's office. They rather have John Steenhuisen as a minister in the presidency. We don't know doing what. So we're going to have to wait and see. You, from your research that you've done and the knowledge that you have in terms of this employment issue, you've written quite a bit around youth employment and ideas. What will convince you as a young South African that this seventh administration finally is serious about dealing and fixing youth employment in this country?
Sure. I mean, one, I think it's around reimagining the role of the DTIC. In terms of
Trade and Industry and Competition Department.
Yes, in terms of incentive design, and therefore that supports new sector growth. We've spoken offline around the rise and the growth of the business process outsourcing industry, which is the call center industry in South Africa, which has now outpaced India, for example. DTIC came in.
So we have a bigger call center sector than India today?
We've now surpassed them, yes. And that came on the back of a catalyzed investment into the BPO industry. But also we then looked at incentives to ensure that we create a thriving space for that. And so the role of the DTIC in designing meaningful incentive structures, I think, is quite important. The second thing that we're really going to need to see is understanding the interrelationship between our education cluster as well as private sector in terms of curriculum design. Because the problem is that we are creating supply, but there's a mismatch from a demand point of view. And so once we partner really well there, and this is for me social contracting at work.
Okay, before your next point, that mismatch is not about numbers, it's about the type of skills, isn't it?
It's the type of skills and type of I guess, where companies are growing towards. And so their budgeting process and all the things they want to do are misaligned with the skills that we are creating. And so we have a labor force that is structurally mismatched from the demands, the skills that we demand in the economy. And that actually creates inherently a big problem. This is why I introduced the idea again around vocational skills and TVET colleges, and that becoming a space that we really double click on to ensure that we are able to celebrate both the kind of pure academic process in terms of growth and development, as well as then the skills-based approach in terms of how we grow in our employment.
Is there another something final that we might have missed in terms of moving the needle against youth unemployment?
Sure. I mean, I think one, money.
You need capital.
We need capital. We need capital to support, and I'll go back to the small business department. In China, when they do their 5-year planning, they have a fund that runs parallel with that. I think in the 1 year they had a default ratio or payment failure rate of 94%. But they were happy with that. They were comfortable with that because there's innovation that's taking place, there's learning that's taking place, because you've got to have patient capital when you're trying to grow small and medium enterprises. And so we need capital also to support the growth of youth interest.
We're going to need a different level of boldness from in the 7th administration from what you're saying, because if a country like China is willing to put a fund as it promotes a particular plan that is a 5-year plan, and no matter the outcome, they're still happy because they've made some progress somewhere. They don't then say, no, it's not going to happen again.
No, 100%. I mean, I think the election outcome shows that it can't be business as usual. And I think based on the fact that we can't do business as usual, we really then have to come back to the electorate and say, we've rethought our position, we've rethought your cries and your screams, and I think we're going to intently do something very different in the way in which we've done it before.
And put different leadership in place,
100%.
because you don't need the same old, as you said. If it's not going to have to be business as usual to tackle youth unemployment, you can't have the same old voices around the table trying to tackle the same issue. You need some fresh ideas. You need some innovative ideas.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. That's Economist Sfiso Skenjana, who does quite a lot of research locally and globally around the issue of employment and unemployment, and has written quite a lot about it. On this occasion, of course, of Youth Day, thought let's have this discussion to say, what should the 7th administration do differently? I hope some people are listening, and let's see who Matamela Ramaphosa will put in these very important portfolios of labor and employment. You know, Thulas Nxesi, as far as I understand, is not going to be available. He's not on the ANC list. And then, of course, who's going to be in the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition? We know, of course, Ibrahim Patel is moving on, as he announced himself before the elections. But we'll have to wait and see. There's a lot of work to be done, but it is possible.